The F-86 Sabre was and will always be the fighter pilot's fighter. I'm one of the lucky guys who had a chance to fly one, and I want to share some of my thoughts and experiences of my very first flight. I've always felt connected to the F-86 Sabre. From being a kid building plastic models and staring at its perfect form, I've always thought it was a good looking and perfect fighter. I never thought I would have a chance to fly one of these jets, so a few years ago when I was retiring from the Royal Canadian Air Force after having been the leader of the Snowbirds, I was approached by the Vintage Wings Museum in Gatineau, Quebec, who had recently purchased a Golden Hawk F-86 Sabre and asked me to demonstrate and fly this jet for them around North America. A real honor and a real privilege. Of course, I jumped at the chance and I was thrilled. This particular Sabre was very inviting to me. Not only was it a Canadian Mark V Sabre built in Montreal at Canadair, it was painted up as the Golden Hawk's jet team demonstration aircraft. And given my background as a snowbird pilot, I thought that pretty cool. In fact, the Golden Hawks were a really famous aerobatic team that set a new standard in the world for jet formation teams and really have become an iconic symbol of jet formation aerobatics. And then I found out there was another little connection to the F-86 for me through my grandfather, who was a Spitfire pilot in World War II, and like many, he resigned from the RCAF at the end of the war. But he got a call back in the 50s from the Royal Canadian Air Force to go fly the F-86 Sabre. Very tempting. But as life would have it, he had just met my grandmother, and he had just received word that he got a position with the fire department in Sudbury, Ontario, a mining city, and the fireman was one of the most coveted jobs in town. So with great reluctance, he declined. But when he found out I had the chance to fly an F-86, he told me that story, and he was super happy to hear that. Exciting for me, and a bit of an honor too. One of the things you take in right away when you get close to an F-86 is that it isn't a very big jet at all, unlike the jets that followed, like the 101, the F4, and the F100, for example. The engineering kept the jet small and used every square inch of volume for something. And for a fighter, the front profile is quite small, which is great for being undetected visually. Another thing you realize when you walk up to the jet is that your first flight is in fact solo, which was a first for me. And it puts pressure on a guy when you take this rare, irreplaceable airplane up. And despite the fact I was confident in my flying abilities, the fact of the matter was it wasn't mine airplane. And as they say, you don't want to scratch Dad's car, right? Especially if you have a name like Scratch. In truth, there's considerable ground school you take before you get to fly this airplane, and you get briefed by pilots that have flown it, both historically and some of the other recent museum pilots. So I did feel ready to get in the airplane, and I certainly felt the call from the airplane to get in and fly it. I remember starting the jet for the first time, and this distinct sound as the Arenda 14 engine came to life. It made me think of waking up a dragon and this low rumble as it slowly woke up after years of slumber. It was a really cool sensation. And I also love the way this jet taxied. Not only does the jet look good, but it just feels right as well. And there was this crisp sense of positive control when you're maneuvering the airplane, as if it knew where it wanted to go. And it gave me quite a bit of confidence early on that I was connected to the airplane even before I got airborne. It was a comforting feeling to have that connection early on. Of course, at the end of the runway for your very first flight solo in this new jet, I did my checks twice, maybe 3 times to make sure I had everything just perfect before I launched into the air. Now at the button of the runway, I spooled up the engine by advancing the throttle very slowly. Even though the Arenda 14 engine was one of the most advanced engines at the time, it actually required quite a bit of pilot monitoring, because if you advance the throttle too fast, you could actually overtemp the airplane, exceeding the EGT, exhaust gas temperature limits, and you could cook the engine and destroy it. So you still had to monitor it as a pilot, so you didn't damage the engine in the process. But I loved the smooth acceleration of the jet, and I could just feel it embracing that takeoff roll and the wings starting to come to life, and that gentle liftoff as it just confidently lifted off from the runway. Definitely had a real solid feel as it went airborne, and I felt connected again at that moment. I said, okay, it's just an airplane now, let's just go fly it. As I climbed out, I was thinking about the pilots that flew the F-86 in the Korean War and in the Cold War, and I couldn't help thinking about those 6 50 caliber machine guns sticking in the nose, had this lethal fighter that I was flying, this gunfighter. But some of the later models, the Sabre 6 in fact, actually could have AIM-9 heat-seeking missiles, making it one of the first missile jet aircraft. And even some of the later models were equipped with bombs and napalm, and some of them even reportedly had a tactical nuke that could be launched on this thing. Once I got to the training area and got some clear air, I needed to shake out the jet and get a sense of its stall characteristics. Really important when you're flying a new airplane, let alone a new airplane solo for the very first time. But I was really pleasantly surprised to feel the jet. One of the areas I had heard where people get in trouble with the F-86 is in a tight final turn. And if they stall the airplane there, in many cases it's unrecoverable, and they're reportedly many pilots that have been killed back in the day from trying to tighten up that final turn, perhaps blowing through the center line and pulling aggressively to correct back. So I was very acutely aware of that old axiom, runway airspeed, when I was considering that final turn. But more importantly, I did a whole bunch of final turn stalls in the air just to feel that and to feel what would happen if I did drop the inside wing. And sure enough, when you did get into that stall in the final turn, you lost a lot of altitude before the airplane would come back. And so that's not a place that you would want to be, low to the ground, slow, behind the power curve, and with the engine spooled back. So I was very mindful of that one area that'll get you. Once all the stalls were done and I felt really comfortable with the airplane, it was time to shake the airplane out a little bit. After all, I'm an aerobatic pilot and I'm going to be flying this jet in the airshow circuit, so I need to feel what it does aerobatically. And of course, I'm going to start with high G turns and rolls, and I was so pleasantly surprised how crisply this F-86 rolled. And with that Mark 6 wing on it, it just beautifully rolled around. In fact, it had about the same roll rate that I was familiar with flying the F-18, so I felt very at home with this. And you know, when you rack it up, you could knock your head off the canopy on this thing. It's a formidable fighter jet that can maneuver just fine. It really held its energy nicely, and that's very important. There's quite a few airplanes out there that once you start pulling on them 4 and 5G, the energy bleeds off and it can't sustain that speed or that G. The F-86 that I was flying, and perhaps it's with that bigger Arenda 14 engine, held so nicely. In fact, I found what was called corner speed really nice, and it just held that energy so cleanly. That would be very important in a dogfight, because when you're fighting another jet, you don't want to worry about the jet bleeding off its energy and not being able to max perform that airplane. So super happy about that. Given that I'm going to be flying this jet in the airshow circuit, I needed to feel what it was like in the vertical, because I will be doing some vertical maneuvering back to the show site and doing some loops at show center. And so I really wanted to get comfortable with this jet in the vertical. And I went with the numbers that the test pilot at Vintage Wings gave me, and I went within a knot of those exactly on profile, and sure enough, the jet just went vertically around in a loop just beautifully. And it gave me great confidence right away. Really nice handling characteristics, slow speed at the top of the loop. And I was like, yes, this is not just going to be a great airshow airplane, but I could tell that it was a really good fighter for going into the vertical, which is really important in a fighter engagement, because the jet that gets the vertical advantage typically will win the fight. And so I could see how this would have been an advantage for the F-86 over some other jets in that air-to-air dogfighting arena. 30 minutes into the flight, I was like, wow, what am I missing here? Because I feel so connected to the airplane. In fact, I can honestly say that I've never felt as connected to an airplane in my life as I have to the F-86 in this very first flight, which alarmed me a little bit, because I was asking myself, am I missing anything? And, you know, stay on your toes here. Don't get too comfortable, because that's when an airplane will bite you, when you get a little bit complacent. But even in this first flight, I felt so connected to the airplane. I could tell why the fighter pilots of the day loved the F-86 so much, because already I was falling in love with it. After playing out in the airspace, like all fighter jets, you're fuel critical on takeoff. It was time to come home after 45-50 minutes. The airplane just landed like it knew it needed to. It wanted to be in the air because it was a beautiful flying aircraft, but it graciously accepted the earth again, and it felt like it knew how to land all on its own. It was a wonderful feeling to land the jet. Of course, I couldn't help myself taxiing in. I had a huge grin on my face. I felt a great sense of pride that I've achieved something that very few pilots, let alone fighter pilots, have been able to achieve, is fly an F-86 Sabre. And so I felt the privilege of that. And being so connected to the airplane early on, I really felt like I had been gifted something unique in aviation. And I was really, really happy, to fly the fighter pilot's fighter. Coming up soon in another episode, I actually want to break down what it's like to fly this jet in the airshow circuit. Again, using an airplane for a specific mission, not just flying around, but max performing it in the low-level environment takes unique skills and lots of training, of course, but it really does show you what a jet is about. And I'll go through the various sequences and maneuvers in that airshow routine and describe how the F-86 responded to that and how I overcame a few of the little idiosyncrasies of the airplane to make sure I was flying, of course, a safe and effective show. So please subscribe and join me on this adventure of sharing my experience in aviation. Send me some comments. I'd love to hear from you. And we'll see you next time. Check 6.